Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so great to have such a large crowd here to learn about Kevin Sabet's new book. My name is Marsha Lee Taylor, and I am delighted to be here today with Kevin, who I have known for, I don't know, probably a couple of decades, right, Kevin?
That's
Uh,
right.
though that would mean we met when we were toddlers. But it's great to be here to talk about this really, really timely new book, Under the Influence: America's Drug Habit and How We Can Overcome It. Um, I think that probably a lot of people here know Kevin and are familiar with his work, but I thought it would be helpful just to talk a little bit about it, just to level set in case there are some people who are new to Sam and new to Kevin. So Kevin really is one of the leading voices on drug policy, not only in the United States, but really around the globe. And he has the distinction of serving in both Democratic and Republican administrations at the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Kevin was in the Clinton administration and the Bush administration and in the Obama administration. And I think that really encapsulates how Kevin views drug policy, really in a nonpartisan, not even just bipartisan, really a nonpartisan way. And taking a slight detour from the introduction, I want to just call out a couple of sentences, Kevin, that you wrote in the book. And when you wrote these, you were talking about other people, but I think it really applies to you. You commended people who eschew ideology in favor of evidence, put biases aside for the betterment of people, and move forward with the hope that change can happen. They're conservative, liberal, and everything in between. They're testaments to the fact that there are strategies that can work and save lives. And I think that's really what Kevin has dedicated his career to doing, to really being in that common sense area and calling balls and strikes where he sees them in the drug policy field. So in addition to Kevin's experience working in government, he also is a distinguished academic. He's an assistant adjunct professor at Yale Medical School, a fellow at Yale's Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and a columnist at Newsweek. And as many of you here today know, together with Patrick Kennedy, he founded Smart Approaches to Marijuana and is also the founder of the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. One Nation is Kevin's fourth book, which is very impressive. His three others are Smokescreen: What the Marijuana Industry Doesn't Want You to Know, Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths About Marijuana, and Contemporary Health Issues on Marijuana. So Kevin, congratulations on this book. I think it is really an interesting read, and I think it's something that could really appeal to people who don't know anything about drug policy, who've never really thought about it in a serious way, as well as people who've spent their career working in this space. You really go into detail on how we got here, but also looking at the road forward. And I think this book comes at a very critical moment. As you mentioned in the book, we've lost 1 million people to drug fatalities in the past 25 years, which is staggering to even think about. We've seen the drug landscape really transform, and now we are just bombarded with synthetic substances that are really difficult to decipher. They're really hard to combat. It's an entirely different landscape than when we were looking at farmed plants like coca and opium poppy. And we also are seeing, some really sharp rhetoric about anti-drug policies, but aren't really seeing the budgets to back that up, and some critical cuts, particularly in the treatment area, that really will harm our ability to really make our way out of this problem. And then, of course, we have the legalization and commercialization issue. And we've seen so many states legalize marijuana either for medical or recreational use. And we have a movement now to reschedule marijuana at the federal level. So it's really the stakes are high and the terrain is as rocky as it's ever been. So I wanted to ask you about this moment that we're in. And, you know, in the book, the overarching theme seems to be that we've had this ping-ponging between really harsh, sort of penalty-focused policies to these really permissive policies. And, you know, as in many things, the answer seems to be someplace in the middle. Can you talk a little bit about that and you know, sort of what you're seeing now and what you're seeing as the way forward?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that. First of all, very kind introduction. It's an honor to be introduced by you and have you on here, and also all the amazing people that I noticed are attending. I actually was thinking I'd like to go down the list, but we'd probably be here all day because you're all doing incredible work. I could go on and on about each of you that I see. And you know, again, Marcia, coming from you, very kind words. You all know you're too humble to say so, but you know, as a former president or former CEO of the Partnership for Drug-Free America, that iteration that this became Partnership at drugfree.org and now Partnership to End Addiction. Obviously, you've done incredible work there, and also with then Senator Biden when he was the judiciary, and of course the great Joe Califano at CASA. So really, it's an honor to work with you. We're very lucky to work with you, and really, I appreciate you doing that. And as you were saying that introduction, I literally almost like shed a tear because we've had a very busy couple days. I'm in Washington, and we've been hustling and bustling and everywhere. And it's like the first time I've actually sat down, I think, in 36 hours and just paused to reflect on this book, which is incredible. It's finally coming out in the next, 3 weeks. It was supposed to come out last week, and there was a little bit of a mix-up and error with the publisher. So we're excited that it's coming out November 11th, and I'm very excited about that. Yeah, definitely. I feel like we've embraced this sort of false dichotomy with not just with marijuana, that too, but with just drug policy generally, where we look at these sort of extremes of whether it's heavy sort of enforcement focused and seeing this as only a sort of a moral issue, and there are moral aspects, no doubt about it, to drugs. We can't say that there are not moral aspects, moral implications for our policies. Of course, there are. But to only look at it in that lens versus then the other extreme of kind of looking at it only as maybe an individual choice, as something no more than, your kind of, coffee that you like, and kind of thinking that there's really nothing out there that works. And then therefore saying, well, we should just kind of let people do whatever they want. And that's kind of where I think the extreme right and extreme left meet actually on this issue, as they do on many other issues, is sort of this libertarian side, which part of my book talked about that is sort of the how in some ways libertarianism has taken over a lot of aspects of public health on this, especially when it comes to this term harm reduction, which I talk about at length, which is sometimes a term I didn't want to wrestle with. It was too difficult. I didn't want to talk about it because it means so many different things to so many different people, and it's the fastest and easiest way to get into a shouting match with somebody in this field probably is to raise that term. But I decided I needed to confront that head on, and I do so in the book and talk about these kind of debates, and also how really these debates are not new. They've been going on for a very long time. So yeah, I see today's discussion of drug policy kind of a continuation of the history that we've had in this country of kind of going from one extreme to the other and not really knowing where to land. And part of why I wrote this book is to help us land somewhere that sort of combines compassion with accountability, understands this is both a biological disorder, but it's also a behavioral one. And that has different implications than, say, just somebody with diabetes or heart disease. And it also has different implications than somebody with just sort of what you would call traditional criminal behavior. This is sort of different, and it takes a kind of different look and a bit of a nuanced approach, which, especially in the town I'm in right now, is not always the approach we take.
Well said. So the historian David Musto wrote a book famously dubbing addiction as the American disease. Your title picks up on that as well, One Nation Under the Influence. And we have had a long history with various substances through the ages in our country, and whether it's alcohol or stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine, or opiates like heroin and now fentanyl, the substance may change, but there are a lot of underlying issues that are very much the same. But we kind of, in the policy arena, tend to play whack-a-mole, and address substances in silos.
Yeah.
The issues, sort of how you approached it in the book, the solutions that you offer up really are more comprehensive. And can you talk a little bit about that, about prevention, about treatment, about innovative courts like the HOPE program in Hawaii, and those programs that kind of go across substances?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And, you bring up David Musto, which is great. Everybody should read his book, The American Disease, which, it was really the seminal book on American drug policy history, really up until about the turn of this century. And the rest of us are just always playing catch up. We're all children compared to the late great David Musto, who wrote that wonderful book, and many editions of it. Goes into the history of the parent movement in detail that I could only dream about, knowing the inside of the opium conventions of 1909 in Shanghai and all that. So I definitely recommend it. And yeah, I mean, we're all learning from people like David and others who I reference in the book, like Bob DuPont and the late Mitch Rosenthal and many others. And I think they would all agree to some extent. I mean, there would be some disagreement, but generally agree that we have to look at this from a comprehensive approach. And it almost sounds cliche because that's every drug strategy, really. As I always said, we need a comprehensive approach, but we don't always see that backed up with dollars. We don't always see that backed up with rhetoric. And this issue of looking at all the drugs, I thought was very important because, most people, I guess, because of my work in the last 10 years, kind of know me as the marijuana guy in many ways. And in some ways, writing this book was my way to also kind of get out of that box. I almost felt like it was just becoming too obvious and too lazy. It was like, in some ways, I was my name was like, not to sound self-important, but it's sort of objectified as like, when marijuana, get the Kevin Sabet, line in here, or do we need to check with the Kevin Sabet? We're writing an article on marijuana. And, I've always been interested in all drugs and all drug policy, but beyond that, these issues, as people like Bob DuPont have taught us, they're interchangeable in many ways. It doesn't really matter what drug we're talking about. Yes, I do think there should be a distinct focus on marijuana because of the unique political and sort of cultural landscape that I do think it holds. And so obviously that's why I work at SAM, and that's why, that we do so much of that work. And that's why I was up there today on the Hill, actually telling a Republican Senate member, asking why, he was sort of talking in this way that made everything sound inevitable with marijuana and not a big deal. So the marijuana issue is definitely a big deal. And I understand sort of the role that we have as SAM is really important, globally, actually, if you can believe it, on this. But these issues really traverse all drugs. And, as our mentor, Marcia Joe Califano, taught us, is that if you don't use drugs before age 21, you're unlikely ever to do so. And that goes for any drug. Of course, usually that drug is alcohol or marijuana. It used to be tobacco, not anymore. And I actually go into the book about what we can learn even from the tobacco movement. I don't think we've taken enough lessons from that movement and from sort of the incredible strides we've made. But these issues, prevention, treatment, sort of the demand side as well as the supply side, they cover all drugs because, when you're your brain in some ways doesn't make a lot of distinction if you are addicted to these chemicals. It just likes the chemical. So yes, there are different chemicals and they bind to different receptors for sure. But a lot of the behavior is the same. And when I went around for this book and I traveled around the world for it and interviewed a lot of different people, most of which made the book, not all of it could fit, but the one of the things I learned was that we were talking about multiple drugs really all at once. Like talking to somebody in treatment, they don't see, we look at data sets that say, what was the primary drug of abuse? And so we sort of focus on that. But when you talk to somebody who's, 10 days into treatment or, a year into recovery, they don't talk about it that way. They don't talk about it in a way that, they might talk about a sort of a kind of a drug of choice, but generally, they're talking about multiple drugs. And that's because their brain was, hijacked by these chemicals, these external chemicals that give you a sense of pleasure. And that's why it's very hard to stop. And in some ways, you sort of wonder why anyone would ever stop at all, because their brain is telling them this is the best feeling they've ever had, way above any kind of, natural feelings that we might have on it from an objective point of view. You sort of look at an objective scale. And that's, it's incredible how powerful they are. But whether we're talking about sort of today's high octane marijuana or methamphetamine or heroin or alcohol or tobacco, these drugs all have a very powerful hold. And it's kind of on the margins that you sort of say what has more of a hold once you kind of go down this path. And so it was very clear to me we had to, think about this differently. And I felt like I had to write a book that was talking about this and talking about sort of, in many ways, our obsession with drugs and our obsession with this idea of addiction for profit, which spans beyond alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. So I felt that, for many reasons, including the personal one, sort of I mentioned earlier about sort of getting out of that box, I felt like it was necessary to write this.
Yeah. So piggybacking on two things you said, one, talking about the tobacco industry and the gains we've made in smoking cessation in our country and really changing the cultural norms, which is very hard to do. And then also talking about addiction for profit. So, it's kind of ironic, the fact that we have managed to make smoking verboten in the United States. But it seems like other industries have taken a page from the tobacco industry's playbook. In fact, all
Yeah.
pages, it seems at times, from their playbook. You talk a lot about addiction for profit and the commercialization of substances. And, clearly we're seeing that in marijuana, but there's a lot of these other synthetics that are also part of a profit-driven industry. With the marijuana example, the cannabis industry has really, I have to say, done a masterful job of painting an increasingly dangerous substance as benign, and has created this false narrative about it being this, lovely, organic, safe panacea. And which we know it's not. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, I know you talk to a lot of families. You see the research, but also see the research playing out in human terms. Can you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing and the counter message to some of that nonsense that we're hearing from the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tale as old as our country, is that we do commercialization very well. You might these days, because of production costs, go to China to make your toy that you invented, but because it's a lot cheaper. But you're going to, stay in the United States for the marketing side of it. We're the biggest economy in the world, and the most spending economy in the world, the most resources in the world, the richest country in the history of the world. And so clearly money talks in this country. And when you pair that with these addictive chemicals, it really is a recipe for total disaster from a public health and public safety point of view. And you can justify people, I'm sure there are plenty of nice people that I wouldn't mind as neighbors who are in these businesses. And they've talked themselves into thinking that this is fine, that this is just a tale as old as this country. And in many ways, they're right. But that gives me, extra pause that we should sort of keep repeating this mistake over and over and over and over again, which is the mistake of allowing companies to put profit over public health, which we unfortunately seem to do best. And it's not even about drugs. I mean, you can call out other kinds of companies. We can call out water we drink. We can call out, Volkswagen cars that were imported, and we were tricked into thinking that they were low emission when they weren't low emission. We didn't find out till a lot later. And it just, these kinds of things fall through the cracks, and they're real people that pay the price. And part of this book, I think, is a warning, because I feel like, we are all now bearing witness to just, mass greed, and to this idea that there really will be no consequences, really very few consequences, for going down this path, is what we're being told and what we're being sold. And, in large part, very powerful people are buying into this. I've been able to be in some really crazy meetings in the past that I have no idea why I would be there. except for the fact that, it's usually the fact that like the person putting on the meeting or someone that happens to have a lot of power because they happen to also be rich from some other thing that they got rich from, has a niece or nephew that's suffering from marijuana, as extreme marijuana disorder or marijuana psychosis. That's frankly why we get most of our donations. We come from people who have experienced that, and one in every 10,000 of them happen to have deep pockets that allow us to keep going. And in these meetings that I sometimes get invited to, I sort of it's incredible to see, these are people that everybody would recognize their faces, their names, to just see how, they're either involved in this industry somehow because they don't understand, especially with marijuana, why there's even a problem with it. Because it's just, we're all in favor of capitalism. We live in a capitalist country. Of course, capitalism has produced a lot of good for a lot of people. It's risen many people out of poverty. It's the reason why we are the innovation hub of the world. It's the reason why, Apple Computer and Google and all these sort of modern companies and OpenAI, they originated here in the United States, not anywhere else. And it's not because we're necessarily a lot smarter innately than people in India or China or Iran or Russia or Paraguay or Mexico, but it's because we have really learned how to take an idea and market it. And we do that best. And we give people the room to come up with the ideas as well. And so my worry is that we are repeating this mistake with psychedelics now. We see what's happening there with the investment. And I have no problem with sort of researching these drugs and seeing if they have therapeutic potential. But really, what we've seen is nothing more than just, really putting the cart before the horse in so many ways. And so, when I went to Portugal and talked to the drug czar there and the people that administer Portuguese drug policy, which is often held up as a model for us in the United States, they were astounded. They were actually, in some ways, they were interviewing me more than I was asking questions for them. Maybe I'm not a good interviewer, but they were very curious about how we got where we got with marijuana and even with psychedelics. And these are people that if you were to just read kind of the things on very legitimate websites, like very legitimate think tanks, like the Cato Institute and Reason Foundation and others, you would think that they would be all in on the idea of legalization, all in on the idea of addiction for profit. And they look at what we're doing really with horror. They can't believe what we're doing. And they also don't like the fact that the advocates in the United States have completely misrepresented what they're doing. And then you go to a place like Canada, where I've also lived part of my, the last couple of years. And you sort of dig into why they're going where they're going, which is, really, I think, implementing a very extreme drug policy, not, in a very bad way, by essentially enabling drug use and just finding safe, what they would call safer ways, but there's no evidence that it's safer. And you sort of dig into that and how that came to be, and because you kind of think, Canada, they're not, they're not necessarily known to be addiction for profit, but you actually look into what's going on and you see that it's the same story, actually, that there are interests that are very well connected to people in high places that are in the vending machine business for OxyContin, which would allow people who are addicted to fentanyl to get OxyContin because that is a quote unquote safer alternative. And we should make sure they get it as fast as possible and as easy as possible so they don't go on to use fentanyl. And so, as a former health advisor, I'm going to now start a OxyContin vending machine. I mean, it's just incredible, the things. And so, while this is one nation under the influence and there are very unique things, and that's why David Musto called his book what he did, there are also parallels in other countries and also mischaracterizations that I thought, in some ways, finally, I thought like really needed to be cleared up.
Yeah, and I've thought your discussion about the Portugal model was fascinating because it's very different from the United States, right? With unlimited healthcare and free healthcare is just a very different model than we have here. You also discussed Measure 110 in Oregon, which really was based on that misunderstanding and this misreading of the Portugal model.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about why that failed and just some of the false assumptions that went into that, and sort of what the policymakers were, how the policymakers went from being completely supportive of Measure 110 to wanting to repeal it very quickly?
It was an incredible about face, what we saw that happened so quickly. And, I was writing the book in the middle of it, and I didn't necessarily know how it was going to end. In fact, I had to keep sort of updating it with my editor and say, I need to redo that part because actually there's a new development. So, and actually the story of this book is that I was doing edits until 1 minute before like the 10th final deadline that I got because things were changing on a daily basis. And God help us if, marijuana was going to be rescheduled, before the editing stages. Now I can't edit it anymore, but, because I was going to have to go back again. Oregon was really fascinating because here you have one of the bluest states in the country. In the middle of Black Lives Matter or the beginning of the pandemic, there was this move really driven by an out-of-state entity, driven by the Drug Policy Alliance, which I go into detail in the book about them and their background. And they saw an opportunity in a state like Oregon, pick the low-hanging fruit, pick the state that you'll win on so you can keep winning. And that's been the strategy for marijuana. Obviously, that's why they've already legalized marijuana in the states that it was easy to do so. They can't do it in the hard states. The last over 70% of states that they've tried to legalize in lately, it's failed because they're getting to the hard states now. But so they went to Oregon thinking that this would be their grand experiment into things other than marijuana. I think they also were getting a lot of pressure. Marijuana has not gone well by any definition, including their own, when it comes to social justice. I think, it was kind of like they wanted to end their obsession, in some ways, the legalizers' obsession with marijuana, and really talk about all drugs. Because frankly, if you take the marijuana argument at value, if you're going to be intellectually honest, you're going to really need to apply it to every drug. I mean, if you think that it's better to have drugs that are sold in the open market, in addition, by the way, to the underground market, because the underground market doesn't go away. And you think that's better, if you think we should get tax revenue off of addiction, if you think that the only thing we can really do is maintain addiction and use it in safer ways, then you should be honest about it. And in some ways, my hat's off to them. They were honest. They came to Oregon and said, we want to decriminalize all use, which was essentially legalizing drugs for personal use, they would call it. The term decriminalization I talk about in the book too. It's one of these terms that gets you into trouble because it means so many things to so many people. Again, it's the cause of a lot of arguments that shouldn't be there because people arguing oftentimes they'll agree, but the term is what's tripping them up. So legalized possession, and with zero treatment infrastructure, zero ways to get people to the help that they need, and no incentive. And if it's one thing that I've become stronger in my belief in this after writing this book, it's the fact that not everybody who needs treatment, in fact, most people who need treatment don't think they do. So we have to figure out a way, in a compassionate way, that is essentially going to cajole them into getting help. And we have to be honest with them about it. We don't want to trick people. We don't want to blindfold them and lead them into somewhere where they don't understand what's going on. But we have to do better at that. And because what Oregon did was leave it up to the user and essentially say, we'll give you $100 fine, which we'll never collect, or you can call a 1-800 number, which barely rang, actually. And so I actually went to the call center in Oregon. It was one of them. The main one was led by our friend, the former U.S. Attorney Dwight Holton, who, by the way, ran for Attorney General in Oregon, and the legalizers defeated him there. They put all the money into defeating him because he would have been bad news. He's a good Oregon Democrat. I think his brother-in-law ran for vice president recently on the Democratic ticket. So, not exactly somebody that Oregon should be hating on, but they didn't vote him in because of the legalizers' money. And he went into he actually helped run the call center. And the call center, I didn't even see the phone ring. They were disconnecting the phones because we were leaving it up to people whose brains are hijacked. And when I say brains are hijacked, I don't mean that there's no control. Like, I don't mean that there's no way out of it. And let me just digress for a second. That is part of what I talk about in the book, is this, I think, needless argument between those that say addiction is a disease and those that say it's not. Because most of those that say it's not object to the disease model because they think a disease means you are cast away forever. You have this disease, you'll always be an addict, and therefore, and what that means rather than kind of what it means if you're an AA. What it means is that you're just always going to be using and there's no hope for you. And that's like, and you have zero control. That's kind of the chief objection from the people, very smart people, who hate this term addiction to disease and probably have Nora Volkow on a dartboard, because that's been her main thing. And the reality is, I don't think there's actually that much distance between those people. I don't think people who say it's a disease say that there's absolutely no control, and I don't think those that say that's not a disease think that you're always in control either. So what Oregon did, though, was basically give zero incentive to actually get help. And like I said in the beginning, these drugs are so pleasurable. That's why you're taking them. You're not taking them because they make you feel bad. You're not taking them because it's like putting a dagger in your heart, in the beginning at least. You're taking them because they make you feel really good. And so something that makes you feel really good, you don't want to stop doing. Why would you? And the only reason you would is if maybe there's some incentive to stop. So, I talk about this in the book too. George Bush stopped drinking. President George W. Bush, mainly because his wife Laura said, if you don't, I'm going to kick you out of the house. And then he sort of went and got some help, but that he needed that to get help. Michael Botticelli, our friend, the drug czar at the end of the Obama administration, talks about how if he didn't have handcuffs on him, he might still be an alcoholic, and he certainly wouldn't have ever been drug czar. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone needs to have handcuffs on them. But what that means is there are sometimes external stimuli, if done correctly and compassionately, with resources that can actually help people. And I think Portugal's actually, that was what their reasoning was behind what they were doing. I don't think they do it perfectly, by the way. There are a lot of nuances to that conversation. I actually leave the book with Portugal kind of, probably depending on how you read it, you might like it, you might not like it. But Oregon was really clear, became clear very quickly. I was astounded at how fast actually it was, that when I went to go talk to the mayor. Yeah, it was super fast. I was talking to the mayor, Ted Wheeler. I mean, this is a good Democratic mayor. It just hands, head in his hands, because he didn't really know what to do anymore. This was a state law, and it was ruining his city. And I think it has long-lasting effects. And so we saw a huge change. We saw white liberals all of a sudden in Oregon, in Portland especially, who voted for this initiative, turn very harshly against it. And to the point of this became such a political liability that the new governor, who said she would not repeal it during the campaign, which actually was popular to say that she would repeal it, but she actually said she wouldn't, because she was still listening to the talking points from 2019 and 2020, I think. When she came into the office, 2021, 2022, her tune changed very quickly, because the political realities were this legislature, everybody wanted this repealed. So it was a pretty amazing thing to see.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned that you would have needed to scramble to revise the book if marijuana had been rescheduled. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what scheduling means, and what each of the schedules, really what it means to be on Schedule 1 versus Schedule 2 versus Schedule 3, but also sort of why rescheduling is something that that would benefit the industry. And it wouldn't legalize marijuana. And so the industry is not getting what it wants on that, but it's getting what it wants on something else. If you could talk.
Yeah, it's maybe better than legalizing for them, because they get a instant tax break.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really have to deal with some kind of regulatory framework that might box them into doing things they don't want to, do. Although we have no idea what Schedule 3 would mean for a drug like marijuana in terms of FDA enforcement, because in our history, we've never had a drug without an accepted medical use. Accepted meaning approved by the FDA. That's always what it has meant. We've never had a drug with an approved drug be unapproved, an unapproved drug be Schedule 3. And the way that the previous administration got around this crazy conundrum, which I never thought anybody could get around, it was very creative, they wrote 252 pages about it, was to say that because marijuana has been legalized for medical purposes in more than the majority of the country, and because there are thousands of doctors that recommend marijuana, which by the way represent like 2% of all doctors in any state, because of that, it now had accepted medical use, which is the criteria for rescheduling. So that's the end of. I gave the answer before kind of the question in the intro, but so they did gymnastics to get there, and it will give them an instant tax break. So the industry's excited. They're spending millions and millions of dollars to lobby this administration to do what the Biden administration did not end up finishing, thankfully. But they're doing that now. And what's amazing is that, scheduling, it came up and it was invented essentially in 1970 by Congress during the Nixon administration. And one of the maybe more provocative things I say in the book, which will not be provocative if you're a true historian of drug policy, but will be provocative to most people, is that the law that passed in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act, was actually in some ways a liberal reform of previous drug policies. We had very strict mandatory minimums that were passed in the mid to late 50s in the form of the Boggs Act that were very strict with regards to marijuana and other drugs, heroin. And 1970 was sort of the culmination of the 60s, and it was a way to, in some ways, reform those policies and take away the mandatory minimums. And Congress created these schedules not as a harm index, not as a way to compare drugs within the same schedule and say heroin and marijuana are Schedule 1, so therefore heroin and marijuana are seen as the same thing. Um, that wasn't the case. It was sort of like I say, if you go to a grocery store and you go to a snack aisle, in the snack aisle, you're going to have bananas, apples, maybe single serve raisin boxes, but you're also going to have Oreo cookies. Uh, they're just different. They're different, but they fall under the same criteria. So it's very confusing. I've actually called for a total overhaul of the scheduling system because you could do it in a way that makes sense and that is much clearer. And now it's, especially with this new ruling, this is kind of the high point of how unclear it all is and how it doesn't work for today, and it's being manipulated by the industry. And that's really my worry of that. And you hear everyone from Matt Gaetz to those on the left say that it's absurd that marijuana and heroin are in the same category and were put there by Richard Nixon's war on drugs. That's missing. That's totally incorrect. They're not. They are in the same category, but we don't treat them the same way. And by the way, Richard Nixon expanded treatment only second to President Obama's ACA. So people don't really understand kind of the nuances of our history, where this all came from, and they really don't understand scheduling. And the industry likes it that way. They like that we don't understand it because they understand it very well, and they're chomping at the bit to get that tax break.
Yep. Yep. Point well made. I want to talk a little bit about the supply side, but first I forgot to mention at the top that if we have time, we'll take some questions from the audience. So if people have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat. So hopefully we'll get to a couple at the end. On the supply side, we have seen drug boats off the coast of Venezuela being bombed. There have been reports that military exercises in Mexico are next. We see the cartels reacting to that news. They're paying attention. They're watching closely. In the book, you talk about putting more pressure on Mexico. Can you talk about what your suggestions are in that regard?
Yeah. So, drugs are clearly, they know no borders. There's no such thing as borders with drugs. And that's why it's important that we have to fight the supply and the demand. If you have excess supply, you are going to create demand. And if you have a lot of demand, you're going to create supply because we now have these chemical labs that can create anything you want. So we have to do both. And the militarization of this is interesting. This is not a new idea either. This is something, I talk about an anecdote in the book where Bill Bennett on Air Force One with President George H.W. Bush. And I was honored, by the way, to have interviewed almost every living director of national drug control policy. It's important to know the history. And he argued for this in 1990. And he was sort of whisked away by the chief of staff and others as an unserious idea or one that would be very unpopular. And I can see why. But I can also see the fact that we're dealing with transnational criminal groups who drugs are not their only thing. They are dealing with, first of all, with human beings, number one, human trafficking and child trafficking, prostitution, and they're really dealing in many ways with legal entities still. So, the Colombian drug cartels, one of their biggest points of revenue is the logging and mining that's going on. And logging and mining there are legal ways to do it, but they're on the illegal side. You look at what Chinese crypto geniuses are doing to make sure that money laundering happens in a less than a nanosecond and cannot be traced. You look at how the Russian mafia is involved in so much that's going on with drug distribution of all drugs. And again, the role of Central America and South America cannot be taken away from this because you look at what Colombia is doing. Colombia used to be hailed as a success, right? We remember that. We remember Plan Colombia. That was like a hallmark of the Clinton administration, and it went into the Bush administration. They continued it with the Merida initiative in Mexico, and those efforts have all been abandoned, and in many ways because the political leadership of those countries, they just have no incentive to keep going. They don't see why. In fact, in Colombia now, they're really appeasing the drug traffickers. They're calling for the legalization of coca production. They're saying it's for traditional use, but it's not. It would give a total green light to, again, I don't care if you're 10,000 feet elevation and you want to drink some coca tea so you don't vomit. That's very different than using coca and coca paste to manufacture cocaine, which is what these folks are doing. So, I don't think this administration is into the subtleties as much. I think they see Venezuela as, in many ways, a rogue nation that is suppressing its people. But frankly, if we're going to do that in Venezuela, we should honestly be looking at many other countries too, because it's not just Venezuela, it's a lot of other countries that are absolutely letting this happen right underneath their nose. And I'm not saying we should go ahead and bomb those countries, but I don't mind some, and this, we might disagree or other people might, I don't mind some things that send a message that can sometimes work. We've sent a message to Mexico on fentanyl. And in many ways, even with this is a very progressive administration in Mexico right now, very different than the previous one. There has been receptivity to that because obviously the U.S. is an important ally. I think it should be done humanely. It should not be done in a way that trips up war crimes, but I think it can be done that way. I think there's a lot at our disposal. I talk about in the book that we can do, even more effective than it may not be as flashy, but more effective than bombing boats in Venezuela. And yeah, I'm of many minds on that. To be honest, I honestly see it from many different sides, and I don't think I even have an answer for you in terms of what I if I was in charge for a day, would I say we should do that or not? But what I do know is that oftentimes a drug policy, we do the thing that's the shiny object, and we could do that. That takes our time away from things that we could do to make an even bigger impact. And part of the book was, let's look at those things that make a big impact because they are happening around the country and they're happening around the world, and let's bring them to scale. That's part of the reason I wrote this. And there are things we can do diplomatically and sometimes non-diplomatically with other countries to have them get a lot more serious on the supply side, because I don't really think there's one country out there, and I'm including every country, that are major source countries to the US that is really taking this as seriously as they should.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it really is a global problem. Okay, one last question for me before we go to the chat. You mentioned if you were in charge for the day. So you have advised 3 presidential administrations. If you had 5 minutes with President Trump, what would you tell him are the top things he should be doing to address the drug crisis in our country right now?
Well, the fact that, plain and simple, drugs don't make us a better country. Nobody has said that if there are more drug users in my family is stronger, better, more competitive, healthier, safer. You can't say that. No community has ever said if more people were intoxicated on whatever, we'd be a better community. So I just think that very simple idea should be transmitted to him. Obviously, I would talk about rescheduling and how that's a bad idea too, because that's top of mind. But I think that, his instinct on wanting to do a mass media campaign, he's a master of the media. absolutely put that to work. And we might see that with someone like Sarah Carter as Director of National Drug Control Policy. She just passed her last Senate hoop, and now I think she goes to the full Senate soon when they come back in session. But someone like that, it's not a bad idea because in many ways, while there are technical things that you do when you're head of national drug control policy and you're figuring out what to do about drugs, the bully pulpit's the most important. And I think he has a lot of influence over a lot of this country. Now, would that turn off the other half of the country? I don't know, but I think it could be one of these bipartisan issues. Drugs have always been a bipartisan issue. I continue to believe that it is, even though we've seen fractures. I think this could be one of these true bipartisan issues that the president could get a lot of credit for bringing people together and really thinking about this in a serious way. They may not all agree on everything, on all the supply stuff, on all the demand stuff, but there are a lot of things. And I would invite him to go visit these communities that are actually doing the right thing and bring them to scale.
Yeah. And I love that you raised the media campaign because,
Yeah.
I'm not unbiased on that front, but
Yeah.
I think when done well,
Yeah.
they've proven to be really effective in the past, and I think they can be in the future. And one, just looking at the chat, one
Yeah.
issue that's coming up time and again in the chat is marijuana and psychosis. And
Right.
the real fear of the mental health impacts of marijuana and how that is really becoming a problem for a lot of families. But we're also seeing, some instances, and I know that you've been really careful to not exploit this in any way, but some instances where some of the recent mass shootings have had people who have been smoking marijuana and perhaps have had some of those psychological effects of consistent marijuana use.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And that's something very different from what we were seeing with marijuana 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think we're really undercounting and underestimating and underappreciating the link between high octane THC, which is what today's marijuana is, and psychosis and its connection to violence. I talked earlier about I don't want to be sort of in this box, but that doesn't mean, we're going to continue to do this work. I don't want people to think that we're abandoning on the marijuana issue, because I do think that in particular, it needs specific attention because of the misinformation that's out there. It's America's most misunderstood drug by far. And that psychosis link is very scary. We're talking about, a mental illness that's almost impossible to come back from. Schizophrenia and psychotic-like symptoms that are connected to it is something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And the link that we're seeing, and yes, if you do look not only the last few mass casualty events, you look at the last 15 years, one of the common denominators, not the only one, but one of the common denominators is absolutely marijuana. And we need to do a much better job at tox screens for folks to really understand the extent of the problem. Even tox screens when it comes to driving. We just found out a study that showed 40% of dead drivers in Ohio in one county, had high amounts of THC in their system, recent use, not long ago use. That tells me that we need to do a much better job everywhere of doing screening, and not just for dead drivers, but also with folks that are committing violent crime, to much better understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Another question from the audience is, people are worried that about the addiction for profit interests, and if we do what you had suggested, potentially with revising the Controlled Substance Act, how could we protect that effort from being influenced by the addiction for profit forces?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. This is one of the reasons why I don't think we should open up the UN International Drug Conventions, which is what the legalization groups have been trying to do since, literally since they were there in the early 60s. Because it's a time where, if we're going to do this, then we should do that, and let's open it up. I'm certainly not saying we should open up the Controlled Substances Act. What I'm saying is we need a modern drug policy, which you can revise this with. And a modern drug policy is the opposite of addiction for profit. It's making sure that our healthcare providers are trained on this to identify early use. It's making sure that, the earlier we catch this, the easier it is. Making sure that everyone who wants treatment in the richest country of the world should get it. But for the 80% of people who need treatment that don't think they need treatment, we need to come up with better ways to get them the help they need. And 70% of those in the criminal justice system have a drug problem. That's the first place we can start. That's why I talk about Project Hope Hawaii. And I was a broken record, anybody who worked with me in the Obama administration, about the concepts of Hope Hawaii, which are, making sure that there's accountability in addition to compassion. And you put those two things together with this, and you usually get a good outcome. So I'm not saying we should sort of open things up to everybody. I'm saying that we need a more modern drug policy that does look at social media. The last time we had a real media campaign was nobody knew what Facebook was, let alone Instagram, Snapchat, or anything else. So we need it updated. And yes, you could look at the scheduling system, not in a way to allow drugs to come through, but you could, for example, have drugs that were Schedule 1, but they were also researched more, like Schedule 1R, because one of the really mythologies around drug policy is that we can't research drugs if they're Schedule 1. We can research them. We can make it easier, but the best way to make it easier is to fund research. That's the number one thing you need is funding. It's not the hoops that you have to go through to fill out a 3-page form with the DEA. You need billions of dollars. So we need to think about how we can work with public-private partnerships to make sure we're continuing to do the research. So with artificial intelligence now, and what we're seeing with personalized healthcare, there are real opportunities to get people help in different ways, in ways we've never seen before and never experienced. And in many ways, our field is still stuck in 1965, where we think that methadone is the only thing we can do for opioids, where we think there's nothing for stimulants, where we think we should, flirt with this idea of legalization. And we're completely missing kind of modern tools and technology, and basic brain chemistry and what we've learned about the brain. You could put this all together into something that actually makes a very big impact for people. It doesn't mean we're going to get to 0%. And while I think it's a very lofty goal to have a drug-free America, I think it's a lofty goal to have a poverty-free America, an AIDS-free America, a cancer-free America. Just because we don't have a poverty or cancer-free America doesn't mean that that's not a lofty goal. So it is a lofty goal, but we're not going to necessarily have 0% drug use. That's okay.
Right.
But we can pivot our North Star to being discouraging use. And we haven't really done that. And we could do that very easily if we wanted to.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of reasons for optimism right now. I mean, you look at the advent of GLP-1 drugs and how they may have a great impact on treating substance use. And, I think there's a lot of hope and promise in that. Can you talk about other things you might be optimistic about at this moment?
That was actually one of my later edits in the book. And in fact, you mentioned GLP-1s. This is literally coming out of the bubble wrap. These are the advanced reading copies of the book. So I've never actually
Really
seen
behind the scenes look.
Yeah, no, this is true. It's like perfect timing. It was like we made sure it got here today because it came out yesterday. These are the books that go to reviewers. They're paperback. The real book will be hardback and it'll look a little bit nicer. But this is pretty cool. Repeat your question with what I'm optimistic about. Look, I'm optimistic because there's so much out there that does work, and we do not need to necessarily sort of go to the moon to figure that out. That we have things here on Earth that can help us, and it's not rocket science, is what I'm trying to get at. But what I think is what we don't want to do, what I think we can sometimes have a tendency of doing because the problem is so severe. You mentioned 1 million people dead. That's 1 million people dead, but that's 10 million to 20 million people directly affected by that. That's probably another 20 to 30 million people essentially disabled for some part of their life as a result of drug use, if not permanently. I mean, this is such a gargantuan problem. It is very easy to get hopeless. And actually, how I felt that this book, when I was sort of like, oh gosh, this book needs to be written, because I mean, I've written books. I'm not, we're kind of busy. I'm now a new dad. I mean, kind of busy. We have a largest staff than we've ever had. We're opening up a really cool office in Washington in the next few months. So if you're in Washington and you support what we're doing and you want to come to the open house, let us know. We've opened satellite offices in New York. We're doing work in Vienna. There's a lot going on, and we're trying to raise money. And I think about that every day because now I'm now in charge of 15 to 25 people's paychecks and all in all when you look at contractors and employees and everything. But the reason why I thought it was worth taking time out is because I've met a lot of these people directly affected by this issue. I've met mothers who've not lost one, but two children, some three. I mean, it's unimaginable, unimaginable. The worst thing that could ever happen to you, nothing worse as a parent. And, but I saw some of them, although they would sort of smile during the day and talk about how they're, some of them have organizations that they've started. There's so many different organizations they've started. But I noticed that some of them were embracing policies that I think were rooted in this idea that there's really not much we can do. And I understand you're a parent of a lost child, and you certainly want to think that you did everything you could. And most of those parents did everything they could. They did. But society didn't. Society failed them. They failed them as parents. They not only failed the child who died, they failed the parents. And we failed them because we have things at our disposal that do work. We have drug courts that, if implemented correctly, can be done in a way that save millions of lives. We have this idea of testing and sanctions because we know the brain responds to these external stimuli, which these environmental factors, the brain responds to environmental factors, not just biology. We do have medications now that we didn't have in 1965 that can go a long way to getting people on a path of recovery. We know that, giving people in recovery a second chance, is enormously valuable, and telling those people that they have worth and they are connected to something greater than themselves, that is such a powerful message. These are kind of, you think, sort of basic philosophies that we should have sort of taken and implemented into policy, but we haven't done that. But we can do that. But I saw a lot of these parents actually embrace things that were, I don't blame them for embracing them. I talk about ejection sites, which I know that sometimes the field can be somewhat split on, because it's sort of like, listen, we got to keep people alive to get them help. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But it's rooted in this idea that we meet people where they're at, but we don't take them where they need to be. We don't bring them to a better place. And I think we have to do that second half. And if we're going to bring them to a better place, we got to have policies and practices that are a better place. Otherwise, we're going to have continued use and continued misery. And when I heard some of these parents that I truly love, some of them fought the marijuana industry with us in many of these states I've known for a long time. But when I saw the pain they had, and the fact that they were kind of holding on to ideas that I can understand why, but ideas that I think were rooted in, not in hope, although they probably saw it as hope, but when objectively we're not hopeful, it made me think, man, we need to have a discussion that talks about what can work, and that implores policymakers, talks about it in language that policymakers can understand and learns from our history. We had legalized drugs. We had injection sites, essentially. We had drug dens. We had opium dens 100 years ago. We sort of know Britain has had this before. Sweden has had this before. And so if we could learn from that and then take what we know now, which we know much more now than we did 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago about the brain, and put those things together, we could come up with something that was much more hopeful, to give these parents hope for a new day, and to give new parents hope that they won't suffer the same fate as so many others have.
I think talking about the families that have been impacted, both those that have lost a loved one and those who have had a loved one struggle, is a perfect way to end. We did have one question in the chat about how families can get more involved in your work. Can you just give a quick plug for PAN in our last 30 seconds?
Absolutely. We have a parent action network, and Chrissy and Bronwyn lead that, and they're doing a great job. And this is a way to translate, your experience. And we talk about lived experience of people in recovery. We also need lived experience of families that are affected by this. Again, we talk about the individual so much, we talk about the family and the community and who else is being affected by this. So your voice is key. So go to our website. You can go to learnaboutsam.org and find the Parent Action Network and Parent Action as well. And you can learn all about it, sign up, get involved, host a book event, but it also doesn't need to have anything to do with a book, because as I have said about my previous books, unless you're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or Tom Clancy, we're losing money when you buy a book, but that's okay because it's an investment. We want you to get a book. We want you to spread the word. And there's a discount, even we'll lose even more money, but it's not about money. That's not why we're doing this. And so we want you to get one to spread the word. And if it can be used as a tool, to have a conversation, that's actually the main reason I wrote it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It was a really interesting and timely read, and I really appreciate the conversation. And I hope that everyone got something out of it. And I'm just so grateful that so many people were here to take part in it. So
Thanks
thank
so
you.
much, Marcia. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.